So we're going to move rapidly on, because it's an action-packed afternoon, to look at globalisation. So globalisation is another term that you've heard about, and to a certain extent they do go hand in hand. I just want to start off, and you'll find in your minds perhaps the two topics linking together, because as I mentioned, they are almost inextricably linked. The purpose of business is business. Unfortunately, even from a CSR point of view, businesses don't always do a great job. So here's a list from HSBC again. Who'd have thought when I was putting this together that HSBC would be so useful to us? Top international blunders. List of companies that have had the largest detrimental impact upon particular countries. So Nestle in Africa, BP in the Gulf of Mexico, SNC Laval in Libya, and so forth. So this is moving away from CSR. So change that hat slightly to think about globalisation. What is globalisation? Globalisation is large companies doing things globally. So they don't do it always work very well. So one of the things that Nestle's did, for instance, was they supplied milk products to families in Africa. And for those milk products, you need water to dilute the dehydrated milk for little babies. And of course, what people in Africa don't always have readily available is either A, water, or B, clean water. So what was happening was large numbers of young babies were dying in Africa because they'd been given products cheaply because Nestle thought this was another marketplace they could move into, and of course then were found to be causing a great deal of difficulties. You will have recalled, no doubt, only a few years ago really, BP in the Gulf of Mexico with this huge oil spill. They had been warned previously that there were problems with the safety regimes within the products that they were using. They ignored those safety concerns, even though they were relatively inexpensive to resolve, resulting in a hugely dangerous oil spill and a hugely costly fine for BP. SNC Lavalin went into Libya thinking that was a new market for them, and didn't realise that the way of life in Libya at that time was about political corruption, and so came out of that having been associated with Colonel Gaddafi. Walmart in America came over to Germany and didn't realise, because they didn't really understand any country outside of America, that if they wanted to operate in Germany, they had to change the way in which they operated. People in Germany don't shop the way they do in America. Their shopping hours aren't the same, their social structure isn't the same, their hours in which they work are different. They don't work on Sundays, in most instances they don't work Saturday afternoons. So having Walmart open 24/7, 365 wasn't useful. And so Walmart had to pull out of Germany as an expensive mistake. The same as in China with Home Depot. So Home Depot are one of the world's largest DIY companies. In China, they don't do DIY, because in China there's a status in having work done for you. So whilst we have, and Americans have, a DIY ethos, that isn't the same as everywhere else. And these companies are having viewpoints that says the world is very much like our country, we'll operate in these countries the same as we do here. And that causes problems. The same again with Mattel in China. Trying to get Barbie sold into China proved to be a very expensive mistake, because the priorities for parents in other countries are not the same as the priorities for parents in America. The priorities for parents in America, let's say, are about supporting the child in their play, whereas the priorities for parents in other parts of the world are about education and the development of their child and the success of their child. And the success of the child reflects very well on the parents. Whereas in America, how big your Barbie doll collection, let's say, is a reflection on how much money you've got. Best Buy came over from America thinking that even the UK would be the same as America. But we don't buy the same way as they do in America. We don't accept that there should be different prices online and in the store. We don't go for these large-scale warehouse-type stores. Coke had been unsuccessful several times in India and had to withdraw their products at one time because they couldn't arrange a sound financial footing within the country or within the subcontinent. And also then, some years later, when they tried to go back in, didn't realize that they have to react quickly to PR. So in America, the PR operations in America have a very galactic global view of themselves. Whereas in India, they weren't responding quickly enough to concerns and suggestions that the Coke contains pesticides. Untrue, but they didn't act quickly enough to scotch those rumours. We have Korean Airlines trying to move into America and failing when their airplane was shot down over Russia. It failed to keep up with rising international safety standards. It didn't understand that the world has changed, partly because its corporate culture doesn't allow information to flow freely up and down the hierarchy. And as a final example, we have Ford in Europe. Ford, one of the world's largest and best known automotive companies, came over to Europe, bought Jaguar and Land Rover, and failed astonishingly to add any value to their purchases, and then had to sell them to the Tata Group. So these are all large global brand names, all of whom have made large global errors. And it's this aspect of globalization that we're also going to look at. The consideration, of course, is that some of these companies are absolutely huge. It's very difficult at times to understand what, when RBS was the biggest bank in the world, what that actually meant. But if we take, you can just about see that. If we take Royal Dutch Shell or Exxon, they're larger than many countries in terms of GDP. They're larger than Argentina, Austria, South Africa. BP is bigger than the UAE, United Arab Emirates. So these are companies that are bigger than countries, acting, remember, outside of the control of countries. And this is not necessarily new. I've just been rereading a book that I read in the 1970s about a company called ITT. ITT doesn't exist anymore because it was so big, the American government broke it down into subsidiaries, into components. But that book was called The Sovereign State, and it was indicating, even in the late 60s, that these organizations were so large they were out of control. No government was big enough to be able to control these organizations. So the scale of the companies that we're concerned with here is vast. We can see also that they grow over time. So this is not an inconsequential progression. The concept of globalization has been around for decades, but we're beginning to understand now the impact that the scale of these ungovernable organizations have and its impact upon us. So remember, these are the organizations that are saying we're corporately socially responsible, but to a certain extent we have to take it on trust that that is the case, because no one is in a position to do much about it, except themselves. So globalization is in part about large organizations operating on an increasingly global basis, but in part it's also about non-European, non-Western companies becoming increasingly large and working together to attack and address consumers within Europe and the West. So we have increasingly growing areas within the world who are gaining a foothold in the world's economy. It used to be just, of course, us and the Americans, or Europe and the Americans. But now it's Brazil, it's Russia, it's India, China and South Africa. They're the next range of companies coming through, as countries coming through. Then it's Mexico, India, Indonesia, Nigeria and Turkey. And these are all offering emerging markets. So the consideration is that we have these huge organizations expanding globally, and in their expansion of global proportions, they're creating new markets. So the world now is increasingly part of a consumer operation. There are different ways in which we can rank globalization, And this is one of the more relevant means by which we can rank globalization. So we're talking about globalization linking actually two things as I'm going through this slide. We're talking about countries being global and individual companies being global. So we can rank these in terms of whether they're economically global, socially global, or politically global. And the most globalized country, for instance, is Belgium. The next is Ireland, and the next is the Netherlands. The Netherlands exports 75% of its products produced internally. So 75% of everything that the Netherlands does goes outside of the Netherlands. Slightly more than Thailand. Then there's a big drop, and you see Germany as being the next large exporter, followed by the UK. Now, the interesting thing about the UK, of course, and Germany, is that most of our exports go within Europe and a little bit to America. The European Union was the first large conglomerate of countries working together as a trade entity, and what we're seeing in the previous slides is different areas of the world operating together, becoming markets. We like definitions. So what do we mean by globalization? We don't have a lot of definitions of globalization. It's a bit like CSR. Everybody has a definition of globalization, and all you have to do is pick up one or two of them. So there's a difference between local, national, and international business. So let's just start with that level of understanding. So local businesses are, generally speaking, small firms. National businesses are those which operate within one country, and international businesses operate out of the home country. So it's global businesses who operate in different countries as if it was their home country. So an international business has a home country and it operates outside of that home country. Global businesses have varying home countries. So we can look at to see the various aspects or dimensions of this international environment, and they look at, similarly to CSR, the legal aspects by which the company is regulated, the economic circumstances in which the company works, the cultural aspects, looking at the different cultural aspects of the organisation in terms of the means by which people are recruited, the languages used and so forth, and then finally the fourth dimension is the political environment. An international business or a global business has to contend with a whole variety of different requirements, above and beyond everything to do with home. Once you start to go outside of home, the home environment, as you'll be aware from any holidays that you've taken, there are different laws, there are different languages, there are different cultures, there are different ethos. And all of these have to be taken into account by any company that operates on a global or international basis. We have varying terms for different types of countries. And generally speaking, they're called developed or advanced or emerging or transition type countries. So we're advanced. We would be called in economic terms, an advanced country, like the United States, Switzerland, Netherlands, and so forth. Then there are the developed countries, Greece, Hong Kong, Ireland, and so forth. And then there are the emerging economies, which includes China, which includes India. And then finally there's the transition or frontier ones. So these are the next level along. So the view is that over a period of time, all countries in this world will become increasingly dominant, increasingly strong within particular regions. And our position here in this country and within Europe is that we have a position of strength that is being undermined and has been undermined for several decades now. We talked in the first week about different types of structures. So in terms of globalization and international business, there are different types of structures, and the terms here relate to multinationals. So there are multinational corporations. So they're the commercial operations that invest in different countries offering different products and services. But not all companies and organisations are strictly commercial. There's multinational enterprises. So Lloyd's of London, for instance, or accounting partnerships which operate around the world are not strictly classed as multinational corporations. They're classed as multinational enterprises. Then you also get another type of organisation which also works on a global basis, an international basis, but they're not real enterprises. So the International Olympic Committee, for instance, or the International Red Cross are also forms of international businesses working on a globalized basis. And we need to be a little bit aware that there are these different types of standing of countries and these different types of organizations. What is globalization then? Well, there are different viewpoints, and there are different viewpoints as to why it's come about. The historical viewpoint would be simply that it's a natural trajectory of people trading. That if you trade for long enough over a period of time, both trading partners become rich and successful. And therefore, both trading partners will wish to seek out additional trading partners with whom that country or that company can trade to become even more successful. Another viewpoint, a more contemporary viewpoint, is that this particular view of globalization is geared around the development of the IT communication systems. That globalization as we know it today is not simply increased trade with emerging nations, it's about the interconnectedness of everybody, largely through IT, through the internet, and through increased computing availability. So it's only in the last 30 years or so that we've had the IT, we've had personal computers, we've had computers which are cheap enough for all people to use, that has allowed us to connect and become globalized. As always with these academic discussions, there are different viewpoints. One is a historical legacy, just a natural consequence of trading, and another one is that globalization is something different. It's something above and beyond international trading. It's connectedness, it's social media. Social media has made us global citizens. But what it has meant is that we've got new markets, and because we have new markets, we can offer new products. And because there are new markets, the new markets are developing their own products to ship back to us. So what we're seeing then is a perfect storm of opportunities that have come through increasingly convergent cultures, possibly based around the English language, integration of economies geared around currencies, geared around economic unities like the European Union or the BRICS nations and so forth, the G7, the G8, the G20. These are all means by which countries can connect together. Then there's an increasing interdependence between countries. So we're seeing the EU being increasingly trading within itself. We have trade liberalisation, whereas 40 years ago trade around the world was geared around tariffs and exclusion. Nowadays trade is geared around opportunity and openness. And of course we have capital markets that are offering money around the world. Increasingly numbers of countries have their own stock exchanges. So globalisation then we could describe as being the trend towards greater economic, cultural, political and technological independence among national institutions and economies. Divided into two then, globalisation of markets and globalisation of production. Globalisation of markets, the convergence in buyer preferences in markets around the world, implying growing uniformity. It's been partially realised, but local preferences predominate in many sectors. So one of the considerations about globalisation has always been that we are becoming a homogenised society, that everything is becoming the same. And McDonald's, for instance, was at the forefront of this particular viewpoint, that everything was becoming McDonald's. Wherever you went in the world, there was a McDonald's. Wherever you went in the world, it looks like America. And Starbucks the same. And all of these big brands are also seen to be part of globalization. So part of globalization is everything becoming the same. Homogenization, it's called. And then also we've got the globalization of production. We can outsource and shift production around the world to places that are cheaper. Because these far-off places have large numbers of individuals who are cheap to work in factories, we don't have to do that production anymore in this country. We can ship that production elsewhere. And remember, these are large companies that we're talking about as well. These large companies have outlets all around the world, and they can just shift production to wherever it is cheapest. And when that cost factor changes, they'll shift production again. So globalization then covers a whole variety of different aspects. All the slides of this are on Moodle. This is just one summary set. So when we talk about globalization, we mean not only international business, but we mean global business. We mean foreign markets and the entry into foreign markets. We mean globalized institutions. We mean political systems becoming the same. And there's an ongoing discussion within the EU as to whether we become a federalized system within Europe. There's integrated economic systems, there's integrated legal systems, so the laws become similar around the world. International trade, any boundaries are dissipated, and trade becomes seamless. And as society, as individuals within societies, we become similar. So globalization covers a whole variety of different factors. There are a number of particular reasons as to why we are being driven towards globalized economies. Strategic imperatives, environmental causes, and the effects of liberalization. So from a company's point of view, and from a country's point of view, the reason for going on a global is it allows us as a country or a company to leverage our firm's core competencies. Whatever we're good at, we can be good at around the world. Because costs differ around the world, we can acquire resources and use them at a relatively low cost. So if we're large enough, we can maneuver ourselves around the world, taking advantage of cost differentials and adding those cheaper costs to our own resources. So we don't make so much over here anymore. Everything that we buy is made elsewhere. And our companies have invested elsewhere so that products can be made that we then buy. Our difficulty as a country at the moment is that we're not quite sure what else we do. So we used to make things and now we don't, but we're not quite sure what it is we do at the moment, except buy and sell amongst ourselves and within Europe. Another key driver for globalization then is it allows us to expand into new markets. So as different countries expand and become richer, they become new markets for us. Notwithstanding all the difficulties that we looked at right at the beginning in terms of the international blunders, these new markets offer us opportunities. But it also means, from a company and country point of view, that we can compete. But there are also environmental changes which have taken place, which have caused a drive towards or a move towards globalization. So there's been a reduction of trade and investment barriers. There's been the collapse of European communism, which has meant a larger number of countries moving away from the Russian or the old USSR state and becoming economically freer. And there have been changes again within countries such as China and India, where historically it's been very difficult to trade, culturally very difficult to trade, and politically very difficult to trade. Those have changed, consciously on the part of China and India, to change the culture in which they view the outside world. China, by having moved not away from communism, but by having undertaken or embracing aspects of commerce into their viewpoint, and in India, by virtue of the change in the kind of religious social status of commerce within in India. There's also been changes of technology, of course. Transport is much cheaper and faster than it has been before. Computing is much cheaper and faster and larger than it has been before, and communication is much faster and cheaper than it has been before. Who would have thought that you could video link anywhere around the world nowadays for nothing? Finally then, there's been a liberalisation of aspects which support globalisation. So there's been increases in terms of technology. There's been a liberalisation of cross-border trade and thus allowing movement of resources between countries. There's been the development of services that support international businesses. There's been the growth of consumer pressure who look to strive to gain other products from other countries in the world. There's been increased global competition. The political situation has changed. Governments have collapsed and new governments have embraced the more commercial aspects of Western life, as it were. And we've just seen a greater degree of cooperation as countries have seen that they need to compete together and work together. So they need to work together in order to stave off this potential damaging commercialization of the world. So the impact then of this is not actually overly positive. All that has happened is that the share of money gained by the top 1% of earners has increased over the period that we're considering for globalization. So all that's happened is the richer have got richer. The belief is, of course, that the poor have got richer as well, but the gulf is widening. And in not many years' time, the top 1% will own more than the rest of the world. So the impact on globalization on societies is twofold. So if the country or if the company is coming into your country, then it means investment. It means new jobs. It means increased prosperity. But on the outside, for the country that has lost those jobs, it means unemployment. It often means a vacuum into which nothing else is going. There is the potential for us as a country, for instance, to benefit by the fact that we no longer have low-skilled jobs available. We no longer manufacture. We don't do very much on a low-skilled, low-cost basis because everybody here is too expensive. The opportunity is that we do something with the resources. Our difficulty is we're not quite currently sure what that is, and our resources are not trained up well enough to compete in other areas. That's our dilemma right at this moment in time. So the impact of globalization is always a plus and minus. Someone gains and someone always loses. There are cultural pluses and minuses. So the plus is that other parts of the world become more increasingly sophisticated culturally. The downside is that we all become to look the same from a cultural point of view. The other consideration also is that we no longer talk about countries. We've talked about the scale of these companies as being colossally large on the scale of countries. But what we're finding also looking ahead is that the impact of globalization is that the economic power in countries moves towards global cities. So we have what are called megacities. So the first megacity in Europe will be Paris. The largest city in the world at the moment is Tokyo, with 37 million people. The entire population of England is 70 million. So Tokyo, a megacity, is half the size of England. And what we're finding then is that countries become embodied around particular cities. And we can already see this with London. Although London isn't on this list, London now is no longer the little area around the Thames. London effectively spreads all the way up to Birmingham, because people are living in Birmingham and working in London. The communication is so easy and so relatively inexpensive, and the cost of accommodation so inexpensive in Birmingham that the area in which London works goes all the way up to Birmingham and probably all the way over to Bristol. So we have these mega cities, and we probably don't start anymore talking about countries. We just start talking about regions. That's one of the reasons why it was so interesting that Manchester got its NHS budget allocated to it last week, the first outside of London, because what it shows is an attempt by other parts of this country, to show that they can also be strong. So the costs of globalisation then are threats to national sovereignty, the loss of freedom to be able to act locally. The growth consumes natural resources as we consume ever more and more. And as we noted before, the inequality gap between the richest and the poorest grows ever wider. Yes, moving jobs and markets around the world can be beneficial, but there is always a cost, an opportunity cost and an actual cost to those that are left behind.